have two very, very, very exciting speakers today. But the purpose of this event is actually twofold. First and foremost, you see a lot of young people in our audience, particularly those dressed in white tops. The main purpose of this series is to affirm them, to help them, to guide them, and to work with them. But secondly, chaos or community is a very open question that we all want to address, and that's part of the reason that all of you are here. Those of us who are Oakland natives and Alameda County natives love this place. And we are not in denial about some of the negative things that occur in our community, but we know that we live in a wonderful, very, very positive community, but we need to address those issues that challenge the wonderful nature of that community. And that's why we have this program tonight. Congresswoman Lee and Mayor Harris, in this lecture series, which also is produced and supported by Merritt College, are lifelong advocates for social justice. And we need not be ashamed to talk about social justice and to set a goal for our community that we will be just and fair.
Merritt College is extremely blessed and proud of the relationship with the Martin Luther King Freedom Center and the Barbara Lee and Elihu Harris Lecture Series. The youth of the Martin Luther King Center practice the principles of nonviolence as they learn together how to address their daily challenges. Dr. Carson and Dr. Jones, as scholars, you both understand the complexities surrounding poverty, economics, and social justice, the need for change. And as each one of us reach that fork in the road, and we get to that path, and we have to decide which road, which pathway to take, we look to others for the knowledge and the experience that they have had. We look forward to your insights about the future of nonviolence as witnessed just recently here in our own community in Berkeley. So we want to know, what is the future for us?
We hold power, each and every one of us, yet we struggle to see it. We struggle to use our power. We struggle together to take power and use it to deliver change. Throughout history, leaders known and unknown have sacrificed and worked tirelessly because they wanted to bring about just and lasting change. Leaders do not allow themselves to become comfortably silent. They stand and they struggle for racial, economical, political, and cultural justice and well-being. We can all learn something from the ways of leaders, whether they are leaders from earlier generations or leaders today. No one is satisfied with the condition of the world. So if you find that issue that makes you care deeply and calls you into justice, let your passion fuel your ability to be courageous. Let's do more than our fair share of the work. Let's use our power to change ourselves, to help others change. Thank you.
Good evening. I am Terrell Richardson. Dr. King teaches an individual has not started living until he can rise above the narrow confines of his individualistic concerns to the broader concerns of all humanity. Here at the Freedom Center, we live by the words of Dr. King. The Freedom Center teaches us that if we want change, we need to break our own bad habits. We have to replace comfortable silence with verbal discomfort. The struggle for civil rights is now a struggle if we are comfortable. The struggle for civil rights requires organizing, educating tens and thousands of individuals for sustained and disciplined work. Let's go out and speak on these issues so people can capture our emotion, our pain, our hopes. We can't just be activists on the computer screen. I Have a Dream was a speech, not a tweet. I'd like to thank the staff at the Freedom Center for constantly coaching us and continuing to work with us as we go through our everyday lives. They keep us on our P's and Q's. They insist that we do the work of becoming the leaders that they know us to be. Thank you.
Good evening. Good evening. I am Andres Bustamante, and I am a junior at Kipking Collegiate. Thank you for being here. Thank you for this beautiful opportunity for us to be here as a community. I believe in the joy of noticing the little things in life and recognizing them. I have been a part of this organization for 3 years. And ever since I started, my first lesson was lighting a spark. There's 4 components. The first component is to give a greeting. The second, you give something you're thankful for, anything at all. The third component, you state something you believe in. And the last and final component is state it with your leadership and your culture. We take this time to greet and welcome people coming into our circle and into our community. This is simple, yet powerful. Phrase gives us a start to a discussion, a class, or just a regular day. Today, we face a crisis of ingratitude, but Dr. King teaches that gratitude is the mother of all virtues. He says, if you have not found something to be grateful for, then make up your mind that there is something wrong with you. So let's turn to our neighbors, the ones sitting next to you, and thank them for being here. Thank you. Thank you.
It is a tremendous honor for me to introduce the first speaker tonight at this lecture series. I had the privilege of completing my undergraduate degree at the University of California at Berkeley. And I had some incredible, nationally known and world-acclaimed professors with whom I had great opportunities to learn a variety of subjects. However, my most remarkable and historically significant professor I ever had was a professor I had at the University of San Francisco. That professor was Dr. Clarence Jones. Dr. Jones taught a course in political advocacy speechwriting, where he passionately imparted upon me and my classmates his exceptional knowledge and extraordinary experience in the art of speechwriting. I hope you just heard me when I said the term art to describe speechwriting. Because like a gifted painter or a skillful sculptor, or like a brilliant musician or a renowned singer, superior speechwriting is more so an art than it is a science. And Dr. Jones in our time, in our era, is like the Picasso of speech writing. And this is true because he helped draft one of the most remarkable, most memorable, and most significant speeches in all of history. That speech was Dr. King's speech, "I Have a Dream." And not only was Dr. Jones a speechwriter for Dr. King, but as an attorney by trade, Dr. Jones was Dr. King's legal counsel and advisor. But most important of all, Dr. Jones was a close friend to Dr. King. So now, with no further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Clarence Jones to the stage.
In 12 years and 4 months, from 1956 until April 4th, 1968, with the exception of the Emancipation Proclamation of 1863 and the presidency of Abraham Lincoln, Martin Luther King Jr. may have done more to achieve political, social, and racial justice in the United States than any other event or person in the previous 400-year history of our country. He was the 20th century's preeminent apostle of nonviolence, love, and the commitment to the personal excellence. And yes, I learned from him that you have to love the people you serve. You have to love you can't fake it. You have to love the people you serve. So there are some anecdotes I want to share with you as a surviving line, because you would not know some of these things if I didn't tell you. And it's important that you have some of these things as we consider going from chaos to community. That I first met Dr. King in February 1960. He was 31 and I was 29. I'd recently graduated from law school following military service in the U.S. Army during the Korean War. Dr. King had been criminally indicted by the state of Alabama for perjury and failing to pay taxes on his state of Alabama income tax return. He was represented by 4 superb lawyers. His chief defense counsel was Judge Hubert Delaney from New York, and joining him as part of his legal defense team were Chicago African-American tax lawyers Robert Layton, Bob Ming, Chauncey Eskridge, and then a local lawyer whose then became famous, Fred Gray, from Montgomery, Alabama. One Thursday evening in February 1960, Judge Delaney called me. I was living in Altadena, California, to request my assistance by becoming his law clerk, who would do and coordinate all the legal research that he thought was necessary for a successful defense of Dr. King. Now, when he first called me, I thought he was talking about me going to the library. And so he says, no. You have to go. I was living in Altadena, California at the time. No, Clarence, you have to go to Montgomery, Alabama. And I said, Judge, I can't do that. Then he had learned that Dr. King was traveling to Los Angeles to fulfill a speaking engagement and that he would be a guest preacher in Baldwin Hills over that weekend. And he suggested that Dr. King actually come to my home. So when Dr. King came to my home, and when he did come, he made a plea that we have lots of white lawyers, Mr. Jones, but what we need are young Negro lawyers who can help our people struggling for freedom in the South. I said, "I'm sorry, Dr. King, I'd like to help you, but I can't," because I was so preoccupied with myself at the time. I wanted to be a successful entertainment lawyer, and I was concerned about money. I had a nice convertible sitting in my yard. I had a swimming pool, and I was living large. So I didn't pay no attention to this Baptist preacher coming talking to me. I just said no, I couldn't do it. Anyway, I went to a church service that he preached, and the theme of his church service in Baldwin Hills was the responsibility that the Negro professional has to aid our less fortunate brothers and sisters struggling for freedom in the South. So I thought, this is one smart dude. Come to the right church. And he went on and on. I've never heard Dr. King speak before. Never heard him, you know. It was mesmerizing, just mesmerizing. And as a result of hearing and seeing Dr. King's speech, he actually changed my mind. And I eventually ended up saying I would go to Montgomery. I want to tell you another anecdote, and you'll see how this all connects later. June 21st, 1963, there was a meeting of civil rights leaders with President Kennedy. After the meeting, President Kennedy asked Dr. King to take a private walk with him in the Rose Garden, just outside the Oval Office. During that meeting, President Kennedy said, "I assume, Martin, you know that you're under very close surveillance." He said that we have incontrovertible evidence incriminating Stanley Levison and Jack Odell. Get rid of them, the president said. They're communists. Dr. King demanded evidence to prove their guilt. The president said it was too classified. After the meeting, Martin immediately got in touch with me. He said, "Do you think Stanley is a communist?" I reminded him that he had introduced me to Stanley and had requested that I work with him after I had returned to New York from California. I added, however, if Stanley is a communist, he must have some very special way and time to work with them, since aside from his wife and son and time he spends in his real estate management office, he spends all of his time with me, either on the phones or in person. Dr. King said, however, but I need you to conduct your own independent inquiry and report the results to a special committee of the board that was meeting in North Carolina, which I did. And I met, reported my findings, and said that there was Stanley Levison, yes, had prior to meeting Dr. King, been a member of the Communist Party, had severed his relationship with the Communist Party, and guess what? J. Edgar Hoover knew it. And the reason J. Edgar Hoover knew it is because after he had severed his relationships with the Communist Party, he tried to recruit Stanley and his twin brother to become double agents. And he was put under great pressure. And when I told Stanley, Stanley said to me, "You tell Martin that it is very important that he no longer talk directly to me, that they want to use me to smear him. I will still talk to you." And there came a time when Martin and I had what I call a come to Jesus meeting about Stanley and the FBI. And we resumed our direct communication working with Stanley, but on a less frequent basis. Now, following the assassination of President Kennedy, the day after, on November 23rd, Dr. King and I met at LaGuardia Airport in the Eastern Airlines terminal. We met there for about 3.5 hours to discuss the wording of the statement he would issue to the press in connection with the assassination. The challenge we faced in drafting that statement was to strike a balance, to express grief on the loss of Kennedy and condemnation of the killing of the president. We were mindful to make sure that what we said would leave the door open for the earliest possible meeting with Lyndon Johnson, the next president. But during those extensive hours at LaGuardia Airport, we developed, or I should say he developed, a thesis that would constitute his political strategy going forward until his assassination 5 years later in Memphis, Tennessee. And that political thesis was, it is unlikely that there would be any fundamental transformation on the issue of race and racial segregation unless it was done under the leader of a white Southern politician. That was our thesis. Now, the final anecdote I will share with you, and then there came a time when he wanted to express his opposition to the war in Vietnam. And he had several advisors. And so the immediate threshold issue was not whatever Dr. King said, it was not what he said, but whether he should express it at all, whether he should publicly express it. Since in the spring of 1967, all of those who worked with him, and that included Andy Young, Stanley Levison, Cleveland Robinson, Bayard Rustin, Louis Reddick, Harry Wachtel, we all came to the conclusion that at least as of that time, that Lyndon Johnson had been the best civil rights president since Abraham Lincoln. And was it politically wise to publicly oppose him on the war in Vietnam? Martin spoke to me very strongly and passionately about the immorality of the Vietnam War. He reminded me and others that he was a preacher of the gospel before he was a civil rights leader, and that as a religious Christian minister, he had a moral obligation to speak out publicly in opposition to the Vietnam War. I was then tasked with preparing a draft of what he might possibly say in opposition to the war. Accordingly, mindful of the Logan Act, I wrote a draft for him to consider. In my draft, I laid out the conflict, and then I would write and say, but on the one hand and on the other hand, and I would write a balanced thing. And I sent the draft to Dr. King, and he said to me, he called me, he said, "Clarence, I thought you were my radical." I said, "Well, sometimes I am." He said, "You, better than anyone, should know the Vietnam War is either morally right or morally wrong. It is not a question of on the one hand and on the other hand. There is no moral equivalency." These anecdotal events that I described, underlying them was a common denominator of Dr. King's unique style and substance of his leadership. One, he trusted the integrity of his advisors and their wisdom, even if, in some instances, when he did not immediately agree with the advice given. Two, he was consistently most concerned about what was right, not what was politically expedient. Three, he had and maintained a strategic vision of the importance of morality as the sine qua non of effective strategic political leadership. And he was fearless. He deeply believed in what James Russell Lowell wrote. "Once to every man and nation comes a moment to decide, in the strife of truth and falsehood, for good or evil side. Some great cause, God's new Messiah, offering each the gloom or blight. And the choice goes by forever twixt the darkness and that light." His mantra about African American leaders and their leadership, which might be useful for us to remember as we think about chaos or community, can best be summarized from an excerpt of a speech he delivered in 1956, Montgomery, Alabama. And I quote apart from that speech. He said, we must develop intelligent, courageous, and dedicated leadership. Leaders who are calm and yet positive. Leaders who avoid the extremes of hot-headedness and Uncle Tomism. Leaders of wise judgment and sound integrity. Leaders not in love with money, but in love with justice. Leaders not in love with publicity, but in love with humanity. Leaders who can subject their particular egos to the greatness of the cause. Leaders whom the lust of office does not kill. Leaders whom the spoil of life cannot buy. Leaders who possess opinions and a will. Leaders who have honor. Leaders who will not lie. Leaders who live above the fog in public duty and private thinking. sounds like Dr. King as we are thinking about chaos and community. He may be describing this new generation of Black Lives Matter. Now, why do I say that? If we are going to get out of or transcend the current chaos and try to build what he refers to his beloved community, we are simply going to have to face some difficult realities. And so how do you quantify the progress as we've made? There were some, I think they may not be as many now, but there were some that when Barack Obama was elected, it was the nirvana. We had arrived. America had elected an African American. I think it's fair to say, if you want to understand the chaos of where we are, is look at what has happened since 2008. There is an effort, and in some instances there's been some significant success in mounting a counter-revolution to overturn what the election of Barack Obama was intended and symbolized to be. You were all pretty astute to know that when somebody keeps repeating the theme, we want to take our country back. Well, where did the country go? We want to take our country back. We want to take our country back from that black man sitting in the White House. Nobody wants to put it that bluntly. We want to take our country back, and one of the ways we're going to take our country back is that we're going to restrict the voting. Now, what kind of nonsense is this? If we are going to reach the beloved community, and if we're going to listen to what I call the canaries in the coal mine for the 21st century, the Black Lives Matter movement, is that we are going to have to think carefully about those old fundamental axioms about power. Power concedes nothing without a demand. You don't get anything by begging for it, asking for it. Now we can, and I'm for protests, and I'm for protest signs, and I'm so proud of the young leadership that I see around the country of African Americans responding to this racist-based police in our communities. But at the end of the day, if we're not registered to vote, and we don't go to vote, we can carry all the placards we want. It's not about protests. It's about whether you have the power to make a difference. And if you want to honor, I'm so pleased that we assembled here to honor the legacy of Martin Luther King Jr. One of the most effective ways of honoring his legacy is to carry on and take useful, practical benefit of what he and others gave their lives for, and that is to vote. Every living person who is qualified to vote must vote. And so my message is I'm so pleased that you want to honor the legacy of Dr. King, and I'm really touched by these young people. And yes, keep your eyes on the drinking gourd and all of that and so forth. But at the end of the day, we've got to organize block by block, neighborhood by neighborhood, precinct by precinct. You want to get America to understand what the young people are saying, that Black Lives Matter, be sure that you have the votes to force them to understand. The time of asking and beseeching is over. The time, now listen to me, I'm talking about nonviolence. I'm talking about the strongest form of nonviolence you can have. I'm talking about a form of nonviolence that walks around 24/7 and thinking about how you're going to put your foot up somebody's, yes. You understand what I'm saying? Because we do not, from the road that I've traveled, it's an absolute blasphemy. Blasphemy. But we are now, we have to sit in our young, I have 5 children. There are parents here. The young African-American parents today in 2015 have to sit down and tell their children how to conduct themselves when they go out. What kind of place, what kind of country are we living in? But we can change that. And what's more important, we have a responsibility. If you want to honor the legacy of Martin King, that's what we have to do. We have to change that. So the best way I can characterize who he was is very simply, he was a bad brother. Bad brother. Thank you.
Dr. Jones, thank you very much. As my good friend and colleague Gordon Barranco indicated, you reminded us of our legacy, but also of our responsibility. We had admired people like President Kennedy, President Lyndon Johnson, but our hero and our leader was Martin Luther King, because he symbolized change and possibility. He demonstrated that people could maximize their human potential, exercise their civil rights, and make things better for those who would come after us. And we began to figure out how we could improve education, how we could try to get housing, better health care, and services for our community. When I became mayor in 1991, I really wanted Oakland to really be that model city that Dr. King had talked about. One of the first groups that came to see me was a group of young people of mixed racial identity and ethnicity from Seattle. They were brought to me by Dr. Roy Wilson. Over the past 25 years, they've continued to come back to Oakland to not only bring the theme and the message of Dr. King, but to teach countless thousands of young people in the Oakland Public Schools that they, in fact, had a responsibility to community, that they could overcome chaos. They could make our city, our nation, and our world a better place to live. And for that, I'm not only profoundly grateful, but to see the evolution of that into what Barbara Lee created in the Martin Luther King Freedom Center, and a lecture series that brings us these kind of individuals that not only tell us about our history, but inspire us to stand up for our future and stand up for our children. Yes. We have a responsibility and obligation to give back, because if we don't, we have failed. Then we are part of that blasphemy that Dr. Jones talked about, because we know that people died to give us the right to vote. They died to give us the right to stand on juries. They died to give us the right to stand for political office. They died for the right for us to have an education and to have quality health care and all the other things that we enjoy, because they were willing to give themselves for us. So tonight, as you heard those young people stand on this stage, understand that is our future. That is our legacy, that they will not only understand the dream of Martin Luther King, but hopefully they'll live to see that dream come true. Because the distance between that dream of justice and equality and the reality of racism and economic oppression is wider today than it's ever been. So don't fool yourself, because when Barack Obama got elected, he demonstrated clearly to me, if not to you, that we do not live in a post-racial America. We live in an America that is segregated de jure as it was by law. People don't care how big you get if you don't get too close. And some people don't care how close you get if you don't get too big. But they don't want you to have it all. You can have one or the other, but not both.
So tonight we have another very important person who is with us, who really has devoted his life to civil rights advocacy and also to the preservation of the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and the movements which Dr. King inspired. Dr. Clayborne Carson is a man who I have gotten to know in many, many ways as a great human being, as one who also attended the March on Washington speech where Dr. King delivered his I Have a Dream speech. I learned about his work as a student when he was at UCLA. He participated in the civil rights and anti-war protests. His subsequent writings reflect many of his experiences and the importance of grassroots political activity, something that I call street heat. In 1975, the late beloved Dr. Coretta Scott King, she selected Dr. Carson to edit and publish the papers of her late husband, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And I remember Dr. Carson in San Francisco when Coretta Scott King came out here and you all worked through this agreement. I happened to be there during that period, and it was just such a remarkable moment for me to be with Coretta and Dr. Carson as they worked through the details about how this wonderful center would be established and where Dr. King's papers would be housed. Since then, Dr. Carson has produced 7 volumes, mind you, 7 volumes of ongoing series about Dr. King called The Papers of Martin Luther King Jr. He won a Grammy Award for his audio edition of the autobiography of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Now, in 2005, Dr. Carson founded the Martin Luther King Jr. Research and Education Institute at Stanford University. It was established to further expand the work of Dr. King's Papers Project. Recently, I was honored to visit the Institute and also share the Institute with members of Congress who need to get to know Dr. Carson and the Institute in a much deeper manner. Because I think, and Dr. Carson can tell you, we need the tech industry and the Congress to invest more in what is taking place under his leadership. Because right next door, here down in Palo Alto, we have this treasure in Dr. Carson and in the Institute. So I hope that you get a chance to go down and visit with Dr. Carson and see what we all had the privilege to see when we were down there in terms of the type of archives that he has preserved and the lessons that he is teaching and the stories that he is telling through the preservation of Dr. King's legacy. Dr. Carson has lectured throughout the world. He's been featured on numerous national radio and television shows. And beyond his major list of accomplishments, he truly believes Dr. King's philosophy of nonviolence and using those principles to address the racial and social injustices plaguing our society today. Many of the same challenges faced during the Civil Rights Movement. We were just in Berkeley at our Forum on Race and Racial Justice, and our young people once again in Berkeley made me very proud, demanding that Black lives do matter. And Dr. Carson, I tell you, you and Dr. Jones, your time is still here. It hasn't come, it's still here. And I think we need to listen, learn from you, and pick up the ball, pick up that baton and carry it forward.
If you come by the Institute, you would find that there every day is Martin Luther King Day. Because that's what we do. We carry on his legacy. There's been a lot said about Martin Luther King and the inspiration he provides. And I'll kind of use as a starting point some of the things that Clarence Jones said in terms of what do we take away from all of this. And I think that Clarence can tell you much more about Martin Luther King than I could ever tell you in terms of what he was like as a person. For me, as a 19-year-old at the march, he was just the person who was way up on a speaker's platform that I saw from a distance. And it's only been over the last 30 years since that phone call from Coretta King asking me to edit the papers that I've really completed my education about who he was. Because quite frankly, I was one of those young students close to SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, who thought Martin Luther King is way too cautious. That instead of seeing him as the leader of the movement, I thought he was following us. Because when you're talking about the sit-ins, he didn't start those. He got involved in the sit-ins months after they started. The Freedom Ride campaign, I remember the story of Diane Nash going and asking him to participate, and he said, "You guys are crazy to go into Mississippi and Alabama." So there was that sense of Martin Luther King as cautious, and I always emphasize in my scholarship the book I wrote, In Struggle, that it was the bottom-up movement, that these Rosa Parks was not waiting for a telephone call from Martin Luther King on that bus. She did what she did, and then that forced Martin Luther King to be who he was. So in my view, Rosa Parks created Martin Luther King. If you go back and look at the beginning of that movement, the boycott was already almost 100% successful before he became the leader of it. Who organized it? The women who know, rather than the man in charge. It was basically a movement organized by women.
Yeah, it was.
And so they were the ones who got people to stay off the bus. So I started with that kind of an understanding, and that was one of the reasons why, Barbara, when you first saw us, that was one of the things that we were discussing, because she knew that I had been writing about SNCC. And so the real question was, why choose me to edit the papers of Martin Luther King? But I think that what she thought was that I would bring a perspective to looking at King that was important to have. Someone who was involved in the movement and who could come to Martin Luther King not as a person who idolized him, although I admired him a great deal, but someone who had the commitment to spend the last 30 years of your life studying him. So what have I learned? Well, I have to find out that reason every time I file a grant proposal, because you have to justify why is it important to study the papers of this individual. Don't we all know enough about him? And the more I've studied him, the more I realize how little I knew about him. That I knew his reputation, I knew his image, I knew what the newspapers said, but I really didn't know Martin Luther King, the person. What did he really stand for? What was he like when he was Mike King in Atlanta before he became Martin Luther King? And as I've studied him, as often happens, my admiration grew because I saw him in a different dimension. I saw him as a visionary. He had Rosa Parks and the women in the Women's Political Council to organize the Montgomery bus boycott. He had Fred Shuttlesworth in Birmingham. He had, if you've seen the film, had people like Diane Nash and James Bevel, who are kind of minor characters in the film. Well, they were the ones who actually initiated the idea of the Selma to Montgomery March. So how do we understand him? And I think that what we need to see in him is a person who understood the significance of the movement in a larger context. You go back and look at his speeches from the very beginning, he's talking about what is the connection between what is going on in the United States and what's going on in the world. There's an interesting speech I invite you to read. You can look it up on the web. It's his lecture he gives after receiving the Nobel Peace Prize. This is 1964, so it's after the passage of the Civil Rights Act of '64, right before the Selma to Montgomery March, and the passage of the Voting Rights Act. And he says something quite interesting. He says that what is going on in the United States is a relatively small part of what is going on in the world. Now, first of all, that's remarkable because most Americans think that whatever goes on in the United States is what is going on in the world. So to see someone humble about that. But what he went on to say is that what happened in the 60s was a global citizenship revolution that was going on around the world. So that for the first time in history, the majority of humanity were citizens of the countries where they happened to be. That had never happened before in history. 50 nations gained their independence in the 2 decades after World War II. That was what King saw we need to link to, because that made our movement stronger. So what he talked about there is what are the issues that are global in significance. And in that Nobel Prize speech, he said the issue of racial injustice was obviously one of the issues that's very important around the world, not just in the United States. And indeed, on the way to receive the prize, he talked about the need to support the South African anti-apartheid movement. But what he also said is that the most important issues were poverty and war. Now, I say this because we often call Martin Luther King a civil rights leader. I think that understates his importance. If Martin Luther King had been simply a civil rights leader, after the passage of the Voting Rights Act, he would have retired. Because that was the last major piece. There were some other civil rights laws that were passed later, but that was the last major piece of the civil rights agenda of the mass movement that went on in the South. So if Martin Luther King had been a civil rights leader, he would have said, I've done my duty, done it pretty well. I was kind of drafted into this movement by Rosa. But now I need to retire and go to Stanford and relax, and be the campus minister, and just have a much easier job. But what was he doing? The next time I saw him after the March on Washington, the next time we were in the same place reacting to the same thing, it was in Watts, 2 weeks after the signing of the Voting Rights Act. And he was there dealing with the issue of poverty and all of the urban ills that we still have today. The next year, he had moved into a slum apartment in Chicago. And for the next 3 years, what he devoted his life to were issues that went way beyond civil rights, but he saw these as the global issues of his time. And that's how he ended up in Memphis in 1968, leading an effort to help the sanitation workers in that city. So I think that part of what we need to do as we look to the future, these young people I see in front of me, is I think part of what would help guide them is to begin to rethink how we look at Martin Luther King and begin to see that his agenda cannot be categorized as a civil rights agenda. I look upon him as someone who was kind of drafted into the movement. He did his duty for 10 years. 1965, that was done. And then he went back to his basic agenda as a social gospel minister. And he laid that out early in the 1950s. He said, my mission as a minister is to deal with unemployment, slums, economic insecurity. These were the issues that were closest to his heart. What was he doing 20 years later? He was in Memphis. What this does is it helps you clarify what your agenda is. I'm not saying that the civil rights movement was over. I can take you to lots of communities, and when you say back in civil rights days, they're going to look at you and say, these are civil rights days. Those issues are still there. As long as people are prevented from voting, there's civil rights issues to be dealt with. But you should also recognize that now issues are, and Martin Luther King taught us this, they are global, and there's a new set of issues that we have to deal with. One of the ways in which I express this would be we've moved from a civil rights movement to a human rights movement. One of the quotes that I found once I started thinking about this was one from W.E.B. Du Bois during the 1950s. And he said, civil rights were the bribe we got for giving up on human rights. What did he mean by that? It's a very powerful statement. But when you look around the world today, what you find is that citizenship rights that the majority of humanity gained are not equal around the world. All you have to do to prove that is just ask yourself the question, would you trade your passport for a passport from any poor nation in the world? You know, you could keep all your wealth, keep all your status, just trade your passport. Live that other person's identity. And very quickly you would find out that the notion of human rights is one we haven't done very much to develop. If you ask the question, what rights do I have as a human being that I can take anywhere in the world? Not based on my passport, but just on the fact that I was born a human being, you can't answer very much. So that's what Du Bois was getting at, is that once we gained our citizenship rights, we look around the world and we understand that our citizenship rights in America and Europe and a few other rich countries are quite different, but that's not our problem. It becomes even more evident when we think about all the people who, because of the changes in this country, are now citizens who are looking at those trying to get in and saying, I'm closing the door. I think that we need to begin to think about where the world is going and understand that human rights is something that the battles are still ahead. The battles are going to be in the hands of the young people here. So I think that should give you encouragement in some ways. Because quite frankly, I see a number of young people who kind of miss out, think, well, I missed those big battles. I missed those big marches. I didn't get to participate in that battle for civil rights. But instead, you can look at yourself and say, I've got to fight a human rights battle that is just starting. So I'd like to just conclude by asking you to be a visionary for a moment. Think of a world in which every human being would have basic human rights. What does Jefferson say about that? Life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. Think about your morning newspaper. How many people do not have secure right to their life, can be deprived of their liberty arbitrarily, and cannot pursue happiness? Think about that the next time you think about the issue of immigration. Next time you think about what's happening with the refugees from Syria. Think about that in terms of the issues that we are facing today, and you'll realize that that is your mission, to begin that struggle and resume that struggle. And I think that once you begin to do that, you'll look back and see that Martin Luther King was the pioneering figure in that movement. Thank you very much.
I've been in this storm so long. I've been in the storm so long, but I tried to make heaven my home.